Hey guys, what is up? Kid here of Burn One with the Shadowverse Evolve channel, bringing you another deck profile for the Cosmic Mythos meta, this time on Armed Dragon. This is a really fun budget deck that people could take to locals and easily win. It's a deck that people just don't see coming sometimes and just they don't understand how to play around it. And you could sneak wins out that way. And then we have some really funny tools in the list itself to give your opponent a very annoying time playing the game. So let's just get right into the deck profile itself. Alright, so here's the deck itself. It has a lot of cool pieces that work very well together, as well as some like mini combos you can pull off in the list itself. So we'll just go through the list and I'll kind of explain it as we go through. So first card here is Armor Burst. This is kind of a really interesting card for the list because not only is this removal, it lets you reuse some of your followers' effects or evos even in that sense, where you can use the same follower after you've already evoed it, bring it back, and then evo it again when you pull it back out if need be. And the cool thing about this card is it's kind of like our combo enabler once we kind of get towards the mid game, and I'll kind of explain why when moving forward here. Aqua Nereid, I've talked about this card before. I feel like it's pretty undervalued for Dragon overall. I totally understand why people don't want to play it, but it works amazingly well in this deck itself because of the token it also spawns. And then this is still also a pretty solid 2-drop if you decide to play this on 2 as well. This is kind of like our main ward for the most part, as we're kind of all in on this really aggressive game plan of trying to burn our opponent out while also controlling the board to like mitigate damage we're taking early on. So Aqua Nereid fulfills all of those things together. Being a ward creates a 2/2 follower on the board. Once we hit overflow, it gets stormed, so we can get in for some cheeky 2 damage immediately. Not only that, it works very well with this centerpiece essentially, which is Prime Dragon Keeper. This is kind of what makes the deck function as aggressive as it does overall. I'll talk more about this card once we get to it, but I think without this piece here, the deck would not do as well as it could. So it's a very huge key piece. Fire Lizard here. This card is surprisingly good in this deck, even as a 2-drop. If you play against other aggro decks, the deal 1 damage sometimes can pull off, remove a swordsman or something like that in the sword matchup essentially. But the big thing about this card is it works very well with PDK because now your PDK, or the Fire Lizard, essentially says once you have PDK developed on the board, it's deal 3 damage to a follower and 1 damage to the leader, or deal 2 damage to the leader and 2 damage to the follower when it comes into play. That's the main reason we have Fire Lizard here. It's kind of like our aggressive control piece, so against aggro decks we can kind of ping at some weak followers. Once PDK is developed on the board, it now acts as bonus removal and bonus damage to our opponent's leader. All right, I mean, we're on Armed Dragon deck, so we got to play most of the good armed cards here. So Hammer Dragon Newt, if you haven't played with this card, it's surprisingly really powerful. We have 6 armed spells in total. One of them being Draconic Smash, which goes with that card a lot. It's a very powerful spell as well as Armor Burst. Those are the cards we can kind of pull off the top from this fanfare effect when it comes into play. You look at the top 4 cards of your deck. If you find an arm spell there among them, you can add it to your hand. It's kind of like also our way we get extra quote-unquote draw essentially occasionally, because our hand can get kind of low in this list. That's why we're kind of pushing to be more aggressive when possible. And we play 3 of the evos. On evo, we deal 2 damage to each enemy leader. So this is kind of how we start being as aggressive as possible. Anytime we have the opportunity to evo Hammer Dragon Newt, you should go ahead and do it if you have extra play points just lying around to get in that extra damage, so we can kind of get into the range of being able to just like drop a Forte and win the game immediately. Once we get our opponent down into that range, every turn for them it becomes very, very scary. Draconic Smash, like I was saying earlier, this is our removal spell of choice because it's also a spell that can get into our hand through the fanfare effect. But the spell itself is a quick that will deal 3 damage and summon a Draconic Weapon token. These tokens that we're generating off our Armored Burst and Draconic Smash and so forth are very key pieces to a lot of interesting combos we can play later, and also making sure that some of our followers can trade favorably or be out of range to just get removed by certain spells floating around right now. Dragon Oracle, we still kind of want to ramp in this deck. I always go back and forth on whether I want to play Dragon Oracle in this deck or not. Right now I'm playing it in this list. If you don't like this, I would just replace it with a 3 or 2 drop follower that's a little bit more aggressive, to just like help shore up the deck and push a little harder. Otherwise, Dragon Oracle is really good because if we can get 2 ramps in this list, we can pull off some really silly combos and be ahead of our opponent so much that they can't really answer some of our followers, which is really funny. And I'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to that point. But yeah, sometimes this card is such a dead draw, and that's like the worst part about this card. All right, Armed Dragon deck. We're obviously playing Dragoneer Knuckle Dragon. This card is insane if you've played with this card before. Honestly, it should be played in most other Dragon decks and over Dragon Warrior, I feel like, if you can get away with it, because it just does so much more. One of the big things about this card is once you evo it, it's technically a 4/5 if you give it the Draconic Weapon token that it generates off of itself. Otherwise, you can hold on to that Draconic Weapon token to use it later on instead of buffing up this by 1 health. The big thing too is if you already have something developed like an Aqua Nereid that it hasn't been removed from the board, because a lot of times people will not remove Aqua Nereid because it's not really a threat. Once you build a Draconic Weapon token, you can pop the Draconic Weapon token to give it armed and +1 health, which the +1 health doesn't really matter, but the big thing is the armed trait. So if it's the only other fall on the board, because we play 3 of the Evo here, and as long as we have another armed follower on the field, this will deal 4 damage instead of 2 damage, so it's almost always guaranteed to get the 4 damage. And if you're lucky enough to be able to pump this up to a 4/5, a lot of times you could trade this. You can remove something with the 4, and then when you can swing this into usually another 3-drop that evoed on your opponent's side, that's usually a 4/4. It can get rid of, for example, like Alice, if there's an Alice left over on the board or something like that. It can trade in favorably because of the extra health it'll get. That's like the big thing about this card, is that it's just really, really good at trading favorably and like leaving a body on board your opponent will have to do something with eventually. Lance Lizard, I really like this card even though it's so silly. One, it develops a Draconic Weapon token if you have Overflow active, but once on each of your turns, if you target this follower with some kind of ability, it'll gain an extra attack and deal 1 damage to each enemy leader. So it can accidentally do some extra damage that way. It works very well if we need to build Draconic Weapon tokens and also deal damage to our opponent. Armor Burst is a card where we can target it, bounce the card back into our EX zone, deal damage to our opponent, deal 3 damage to an enemy follower. Again, another Draconic Weapon token. Bring the lizard back out, target it with the Draconic Weapon token to get it +1 attack and deal 1 more damage to the enemy leader. And then we have this 4/5 on the board that removed a lot of things and did damage as well. It's a really fun card to play with. Definitely try it out, obviously, in this list. If you don't like it, I mean, there's some other things you can play, but I feel like having these extra armed followers is really important, so you don't have to worry too much all the time about having the armed trait on board for your Knuckle Dragon. And as well as this card just kind of falls into the game plan of being really aggressive, of being able to push damage to our opponent. And it's also a card that can accidentally snowball out of control if our opponent isn't very careful with removing this as soon as possible, because we'll be able to build it to a 4/5. We put an armed token onto this card, and then the next turn will become a 5/6, swinging for 5. It was targeted twice, so it does 2 damage. So we're doing 7 damage off of a 3-cost follower, which is insane. All right, this is kind of a huge key piece of the deck, because once we develop the Prime Dragon Keeper onto the board and we give it +1 health, especially early on, it's very, very hard for people to remove it, because once you hit the 6-point health threshold, anything before like turn 4 can't really deal with this card 1-to-1. The only time this card gets easily countered, essentially, once it gets to 6 health, is that if we have our opponent has some kind of kill spell like Execution or something to banish it away that way. If we're playing against Haven, for example, even against Humpty Dumpty, if Humpty Dumpty evos and this is at 6 health, it will still live with 1 health, which is all you really need it to do. And so it makes it very awkward for your opponent to really deal with. And as long as this is on the board, every time you play another follower, we're dealing damage to our opponent and also clearing up our opponent's board as well. So all of your followers get double duty on removing things. So this is a really key piece to have. If you can get it early on and develop it onto the board, it's really good. Once you hit overflow, when it gains intimidate and gets +1/+1, it just becomes quite annoying because now we could swing into this or swing in with this freely and not care anymore. One of the plays that you can make too is if you develop this early and you start playing things out, once you get to overflow and this is still your only PDK on the board, after you can swing in with it, armor burst it back to remove something, replay it so we can get the fanfare overflow effect and gain the +1/+1 plus intimidate, meaning every time you swing in now, it's harder for your opponent to deal with. It's going to be a 2/6. If you pump it more with armed tokens, it'll just get too big for your opponent to really deal with because they can't run followers into it because of intimidate. They'll only be able to use spells to really get rid of it, which means they're going to have to play 2 different like removal spells essentially, unless they have something that will just like 1-for-1 it. Sybil of the Waterworm. We need healing in this deck, and this is one of the ways we get healing early on, especially against aggro decks. But this card also has a really funny quote-unquote combo, I guess, in this deck. So when Overflow is active for you, this will gain an extra +1/+1, and you'll get an increased maximum play point by 1. And then at the end phase, you'll heal 1, and if Overflow's activity, you start healing 2 instead, which is the big thing. So what's really funny about this card on turn 7 is you can play it, give it armed trait, use armor burst on it to bounce it back into your EX zone, and then replay it again to get another play point. That way you hit 10 play points the next turn. So if you have Hishi Akebono, which is, I'm sure people saw this card and they're like, why are you playing this card? You can now play this on essentially going into your opponent's like turn 6, turn 7. You can play this, and it's absolutely annoying because you're going to heal 10, which usually blinks like a turn of attacks essentially a lot of times, but now there's a 10/10 on the board that's really annoying. A lot of forest decks, like their only real answer to this card is to bounce it back to your hand, which is really funny, which is at that point you could play it again and heal another 10, and they still have this 10/10 they have to deal with. If not, like you heal 10, they bounce it back to your hand, and you just respond after with a Genesis Dragon if you have that, or just a Forte or whatever you want to do. It's pretty silly when you can get that combo off. If you don't like the idea of that, which, I mean, that combo is really silly. I don't know how you don't like that. You just play like an extra Genesis Dragon for extra closing out games, basically, once you hit 9 play points. Because a lot of times on 7, you can go play Sybil, then the next turn you'll go to 9, and you can Genesis Dragon them there. But personally, I really like the Hishi Akebono play because it's just so silly, and watching your opponent just like groan when you heal 10 and have this 10/10 on the board is really funny. So yeah, that's a really funny combo. If you play this deck, you should at least try it once because it's hilarious. Serpent Wrath, this is our deal 5 damage, draw a card if overflows. So generally we don't really want to play this before overflow because we actually care about the draws in this deck sometimes. Otherwise, this is just kind of our emergency button if our opponent gets like a turn 2 5/5 Ancient Elf in the Forest matchup. This is kind of our answer. Otherwise, we kind of have to use like Draconeer Evo to remove it because it's just so annoying when that happens. You just want to have some kind of answer when that inevitably happens, because sometimes it does and it's really annoying. Otherwise, it's just good removal that also replaces itself. Dark Dragoon Forte, I mean, do we really have to say anything? We play 2 of the Evo because this card is how we close out games a lot of times, or at least having it in your deck is always threatening our opponent that they're actually starting off the game at 13 life instead of 20. Leviathan Dragon, or Levitane Dragon, I always say that wrong. Another boss monster for the deck that actually has some good evos. So we play this as a 2 of, because we kind of don't want to see it till late in the game, and we kind of only want to see 1 per game usually, because we can usually cycle this out back to our EX area if we really need to, if it doesn't get removed, to use the second evo. It's still a really cool boss monster. So the good part about this card is that it has multiple evos. So the 2 evos that we're currently going with here is Levitane Dragon attack form. This is good because it has the strike effect that deals 4 damage to an enemy follower, and then we deal 3 damage to a leader. So this is adds some extra reach immediately. It is a 7/5. This is our answer to our opponents doing dumb things like developing an early Israfil onto the board. Now we can play this in response. Evo, deal 4 damage to it, swing into it, deal 3 damage to the leader, and then remove it from the game that way. And like I said, it adds extra reach for us to burn out our opponent. The other form we have here is Blast Form, which is a new card. It's a very strong effect on Evo. A lot of the times this effect will deal 4 damage to the board. 4 to 6 damage is what you get on average usually. And it's pretty easy to clear most boards, especially once you have 2 other followers on the board. When you play this Evo and then just like blow up your opponent's board, and now you have the 6/6 with Intimidate. It's really hard to interact with. And once again, Intimidate making it so hard for our opponent to actually trade things into it because they can no longer attack it. With followers, they'll have to use 2 spells. It being a 6 attack or 6 health follower, it's hard to remove, and we can buff it up more if need be. It's just a really solid key piece for the Evo. And then obviously, because we do have the extra ramp in this deck, there's no reason not to run Genesis Dragon for the early ramp into I'm always threatening Genesis Dragon for game, because we're going to get the extra ramp. So if our opponent makes a mistake and doesn't play around us being able to Genesis Dragon right after playing Sybil of the Waterworm on 7, they just lose the game kind of, because 10 damage is a lot of damage. It's still an annoying follower on the board as well, even if you develop just swinging for 10. Your opponent has to answer it essentially, unless you're going to immediately lose the game after playing it. And then last card, but not least, Hishiake Bono. I think it's hilarious when you get to play this multiple times. It's just an obnoxious 10/10 that comes on the board. You heal 10 and your opponent's staring down this 10/10 that they have to answer. If they don't, you get a swing in for 10 usually afterwards, which is really, really funny. But yeah, that's the deck for Armed Dragon. This is the version I've been kind of tinkering around with a lot. It's been a lot of fun. Aqua Nereid is a really powerful card. So one of the other combos you can do with Aqua Nereid is once you develop a PDK on the board, you can Aqua Nereid, summon a token. It gains Storm because if you're at Overflow. 2 followers came into the board that were 3 or less, which means that it's going to deal 2 damage, or technically 4 damage somewhere, and 2 damage to the leader. And then you could bounce it back with Armor Burst. If you give it the armor trait, deal 3 damage to something, and then bring it back out again. You get another token with Storm, and deal 4 more damage and 2 more damage to our opponent. This way you can get like it's almost like a fake Forte in that sense, because you've dealt what is that? 4 damage from PDK, and then you have 4 Storm damage, so that's 8 damage reach right there, which is pretty silly, and it easily happens a lot of times. Once you hit like 8 play points or so to do that, if you don't have a PDK already developed on the board. If you have a PDK already developed on the board and you hit 7, you can kind of pop off and Aqua Nereid a bunch to clear things up, deal damage, and then swing in with a bunch of Storm damage, which I think is pretty silly. But yeah, that's basically the deck. Yeah, I mean, hopefully you guys like it. It's a lot of fun. I definitely recommend taking this and trying it out at a locals because it's a lot of fun. Is the deck good enough to compete at a regional level? I don't know. It might be able to. It's just not my cup of tea, or I don't know if I would trust this list necessarily to win a regional, but in a team format, who knows? This can probably get you there. I think the big thing that's going for this list is the aggressiveness, along with Draconeer. Knuckle Dragon is a very strong 3-drop that like usually works as like a 3-for-1, because the Draconic Weapon usually buffing up to a 4/5 means it's very annoying for your opponent to really remove in that sense, and you get the 4 damage very, very often, or almost all the time, with this card when you do Evo it. All right, guys, with that being said, hopefully you like the deck profile and everything. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and all that to the channel as we keep growing. With that being said, well, I hope to see you in the next video. Later, everyone.